There were 4 women they never taught you about. 4 names buried in manuscripts, so old the parchment crumbles at the edges. Manuscripts kept in mountain monasteries in Ethiopia, wrapped in cloth, locked behind iron doors, read only by priests who fast before they open them. They knew about these women. They removed them. They softened them. They replaced them with silence. But the silence did not hold. It never holds, because the words were copied, and copied again, and carried across centuries in the hands of monks who walked barefoot through the highlands of Tigray and Lalibela, men who believed that what was written in the beginning must not be allowed to die. And so tonight, it did not die. Tonight you will hear their names: Awan, Luluwa, the daughters of men, Naamah, 4 women who stood at the hinge of history, before the flood, before the judgment, before heaven itself sent angels down to earth to deal with what human blood had become. This is not a bedtime story. And yet, it will carry you to sleep. Because the truth, the deep truth, the old truth, the kind that has survived 3,000 years of suppression, does something to the body that fear cannot do. It settles you. It reminds you that the universe has always been watched, that nothing was ever truly lost, that even the names they erased were written down somewhere. So close your eyes. Let the world outside this moment grow distant and quiet. You do not need to understand everything tonight. You only need to listen. Tonight you will hear the full account, drawn from the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, from the Book of Jubilees, from 1 Enoch, from the Cave of Treasures, from Giez manuscripts that predate the King James Bible by 1,000 years. Let your body rest. Let the weight of the day release. And let the oldest story in the world find you. Before we go any further, you need to understand something. What you are about to hear is not legend. It is not mythology dressed up as scripture. It is not the invention of desert poets trying to explain a world they did not understand. It is documented. It is sourced. It is older than almost anything in your Bible. And the proof is sitting in libraries and mountain monasteries right now, waiting. Credibility Bomb 1. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned to Europe from Ethiopia, carrying something that the Western world had not seen in over 1,000 years. He had traveled deep into the highlands, into the ancient kingdom of Abyssinia, and come back with 3 complete copies of a text that the Roman Church had declared non-canonical in the 4th century. 3 copies of the Book of Enoch. The scholars laughed at him. They called him a fabricator, a romantic, a man who had been too long in the African sun. Then, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves of Qumran. 11 caves cut into the cliffs above the Dead Sea, filled with clay jars, filled with scrolls wrapped in linen, hidden there by a Jewish sect sometime before 70 AD. Among those scrolls, fragments of the Book of Enoch, not 1 fragment, not 2. 11 separate Enoch fragments in Aramaic predating the birth of Jesus. The scholars stopped laughing, because what the Ethiopian Church had preserved in those mountain monasteries for 1,600 years matched what the desert had preserved in those clay jars. word for word, passage for passage, the same women, the same angels, the same cry that reached heaven. Credibility bomb 2. The Book of Jubilees, which is the primary source for the story of Awan, the first of our 4 women, is not a fringe text. It was found at Qumran in 15 separate manuscript fragments. 15. That means it was copied and recopied and considered essential by the community that preserved it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has carried it as canonical scripture, not deuterocanonical, not apocryphal, but fully canonical, for over 16 centuries. They call it the Book of Division, and in its pages, in its careful genealogical lists, in its precise accounting of years and generations, the name Awan appears. The daughter of Adam and Eve, the wife of Cain, the first woman to carry the bloodline of a murderer forward into history. Her name survived. They could not erase it. Credibility bomb 3. The Cave of Treasures, known in Ge'ez as Me'arat Gazat, is an ancient Syriac text with roots that scholars trace to the 4th and 5th centuries, possibly earlier, drawing from traditions far older still. It tells the story of Adam's descendants in extraordinary detail, the hill of paradise, the separation of Seth's holy line from Cain's cursed one, and the moment everything collapsed. It names a woman, a singer, a daughter of Cain's line named Naamah, whose voice and beauty descended from the mountain into the valley of Seth's children like water finding the lowest ground. The Cave of Treasures is preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, and in Ge'ez manuscript copies held in the churches of Axum and the island monasteries of Lake Tana, some of the most remote religious libraries on earth. These are not rumors. These are manuscripts, with dates, with provenance, with scribal colophons, the notes that ancient copyists wrote in the margins, identifying themselves, their monasteries, the year they made the copy, and the name of the abbot who commissioned it. The women in tonight's story left paper trails, not metaphorical paper trails. Vellum, animal skin, words pressed into hide with reed pens in a language, Ge'ez, that has not changed significantly in 2,000 years and is still spoken in the liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church every single Sunday morning. This story is alive, and tonight you will walk inside it. Tonight you will hear how Awan carried the weight of her father's sin into a marriage that Scripture barely mentions, and yet never forgot. You will hear how Luluwa stood on the opposite side of the bloodline and watched humanity split in two. You will hear how the daughters of men were seen by eyes that were never meant to look upon them with longing. And you will hear how Naamah, the last of the four, the most dangerous of the four, sang a song that brought the sons of heaven down from the mountain and set in motion the events that would end the world. We will walk with Enoch through the heavens. We will stand with the Archangels as they receive their orders. We will witness the verdict. And we will rest inside the mercy that came after. So breathe slowly now. Let your shoulders fall. The story is ready, and so are you. There are places on this earth where the air itself feels older than the ground beneath your feet. The highlands of Ethiopia are one of those places. Stand in the Simeon Mountains at dusk. And the light does not simply fade. It withdraws, slowly, deliberately, as if the sun is reluctant to leave something it has been watching for a very long time. The stone is red and ancient. The valleys below are so deep they hold their own weather, and in the churches, cut directly into the cliff faces. Churches with no foundations, because the mountain itself is the foundation. Priests have been reading the same words, in the same language, for longer than most nations have existed. They preserved what others discarded, and what they preserved begins not with angels, not with floods, not with the thunder of divine judgment. It begins with women. Specifically, it begins with daughters. In the Book of Jubilees, that careful, precise, year-by-year accounting of the earliest generations, the daughters of Adam and Eve are not footnotes. They are named. They are placed in genealogies. They are given roles that the later, shorter versions of Genesis quietly removed, because in Jubilees, the daughters of the first family are not background figures standing at the edge of the scene. They are the scene. They are the hinge on which the whole story turns. Adam and Eve had daughters long before the catastrophe, long before the angels looked down, long before the world learned what it meant to be unmade. And the daughters carried things with them that no son could carry in quite the same way. They carried memory. They carried grief. They carried the particular knowledge that comes to those who are present at the beginning of sorrow, and who survive it long enough to teach it to their children. Think about what these women were born into. They were born into a world that was still exhaling from paradise. Their parents, Adam and Eve, had not simply made a mistake. They had been present at the original rupture between humanity and God. They remembered Eden not as a story, not as a myth passed down over generations, as a place. A real place with real light and real air, and a presence so warm and complete that its absence never stopped being felt. Eve wept for that absence every day. Adam spoke it every evening when the family gathered. And the daughters listened. So, the daughters of that first generation were not ordinary women in an ordinary world. They were daughters of exile, daughters of longing. They had grown up in the shadow of something that was lost before they were born, and yet they felt that loss as clearly as if it were their own. Awan felt it. Luluwa felt it. All of them felt it. That particular ache of knowing you were made for something better than the world you woke up in, and then Cain killed Abel. Let that land for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are right now. The first murder in human history was not committed by a stranger. It was not committed by an enemy. It was a brother who looked at his brother and chose to end him. The daughters of Adam and Eve did not hear about this from a distance. They were there. They watched their mother collapse with a grief so total it rewrote her face. They watched their father stand over the body of his son in a silence that no word in any language has ever adequately described. And then they watched Cain leave. God marked him and sent him east into the land of Nod, a name that in Hebrew means wandering, restlessness, the condition of having no fixed place. Cain walked away into that restlessness, and the daughters who remained watched him go. Some of them would follow, not because they wanted to, but because the world was small then, and families were everything, and the bonds of blood did not simply dissolve because a terrible thing had been done. Jubilees tells us that in the 4th year of the 3rd Jubilee, a Jubilee being 49 years, a unit of sacred time, Adam gave his daughter Awan to his son Cain as a wife. Ride that again slowly. Adam gave his own daughter to his own son. To the son who had killed his other son. In the text, this is recorded without horror, without editorial comment. It is simply stated as fact, the way Jubilees states many things that would make a modern reader flinch. Because Jubilees is not trying to comfort you. It is trying to account for everything, to leave nothing out, to say, this is what happened, all of it, even the parts that are hard to hold, the daughters remembered, and one of them was given to the man who had made remembering so unbearable. Breathe slowly now, the story is just beginning. And in the beginning, as always, there is a woman standing at the threshold of something immense, something she did not choose, carrying a name that the world almost forgot. That name was Awan, and we are going to her now. There comes a moment in every story of inherited sorrow when you have to ask the question no one wants to ask. What was it like for her? Not for Cain, not for Adam, not for God watching from above the canopy of the world he had made and was watching unmake itself, generation by generation, but for Awan, the daughter, the one who was given, the one whose name appears in the Book of Jubilees in a single verse, matter of fact, unhurried, almost casual, and then recedes again into the background of the text like a stone dropped into still water. She was there. She was real. And tonight, we are going to stay with her long enough to understand what she carried. Awan was the daughter of Adam and Eve. That means she was born after the expulsion from Eden, but before the world had fully hardened into what it would become. She grew up in a household that was simultaneously the most blessed and the most broken household in the history of the human race. Her father had walked with God. Her mother had spoken with angels, first the ones who warned her, and then the one who deceived her. And both of her parents carried, in their bodies and in their eyes, the memory of a world that their children would never see, warmth without cold, light without shadow, presence without absence. And then her brother killed her other brother. Imagine growing up in that silence. The silence that follows a murder in a family is not like ordinary silence. It has weight. It has texture. You can press your hands against it and feel it push back. It fills the spaces between sentences. It lives in the gap between what is said and what is meant. It is the silence of people who love each other and have been broken by each other and do not have the language to say both of those things at the same time. Awan grew up in that silence, and then her father called her to him one morning. The text of Jubilees does not give us the details of this conversation, but the fact is recorded with the bluntness of ancient genealogy, and told her she would be given to Cain, her brother, the marked one, the wanderer. What did she say? The text does not tell us. And that absence is its own kind of testimony, because in the world of Jubilees, in the world of the earliest human generations, the options available to a daughter were not the options we imagine for ourselves tonight, lying here in the quiet dark. She did not have the vocabulary of refusal that we carry. She did not live in a world where the word no was a complete sentence. But she had something. She had the particular strength of women who have survived grief that was not their own, who have watched catastrophe move through their family like a fire through dry grass, and who have learned to walk on ground that has already been burned. She went to Cain. And this is the part the short version of Genesis leaves out entirely. Because the short version gives you the murder and the mark and the wandering, and then moves on to the genealogy, the list of names, the begetting of sons and daughters who beget more sons and daughters. Without ever pausing to ask what it cost, Jubilees pauses. Jubilees says, Awan was there. Awan bore him a son. The son's name was Enoch, not the same Enoch who walked with God, not the scribe, not the prophet, but a different Enoch, an earlier one. The son of Cain, the first city builder, the name given to the first city that human hands raised on cursed ground. Cain built a city and named it after his son. Think about what that means. A man who has been told his ground is cursed, who has been told he will be a wanderer on the earth, who has been marked and sent away, that man builds a city. He plants himself in the earth and says, I will not wander. I will not accept the verdict of rootlessness. I will build something permanent. I will put my son's name on it. And Awan lived inside that city, inside that act of defiance, inside the contradiction of a man who was cursed for violence, building something, creating something, trying to make something that would last. Did she love him? The text does not say, but she stayed. She bore his son. She raised that son inside a city named for him, inside a lineage that would produce, 7 generations later, the men and women whose choices would invite the attention of heaven in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Do you understand what you carry? She might have asked her son in the evening when the city was quiet and the desert beyond the walls was dark and still. I carry your name, Enoch might have said. You carry more than that, Awan might have replied. You carry the first city, and the first city was built by a man the ground refused to hold. She knew. She always knew. That is the thing about the daughters who remembered. They did not have the luxury of forgetting. They could not look away from what their bloodline was. They could not pretend that the mark on Cain's face was merely a bruise that would fade. They understood, with the deep bone knowledge that comes from having watched grief be born and grow and walk upright in a family. They understood that what begins in one generation does not end in that generation. It continues, it deepens, it finds new forms. And it was continuing now in the children of Cain's city, in the grandchildren, in the great-grandchildren, moving through time like a river finding its way to the sea. Awan carried the weight without collapsing. That is not a small thing. That is, in its own quiet way, one of the most astonishing acts in the entire account. She remained. She raised her son. She lived inside the consequences of other people's choices with a steadiness that the text records in its silence. In the simple fact that her name survived, that Jubilees thought her worth naming, that somewhere in the ancient scribal tradition, a man with a reed pen looked at the genealogy and said, "Her name belongs here. Write it down." So it was written, and tonight, 3,000 years later, you heard it. Let that settle now, like dust after a long journey. Settling onto still ground, Awan's story does not end in triumph. It does not end in vindication. It ends in continuation. In the passing of a bloodline forward into time, toward a reckoning she could not have imagined. But she carried it faithfully, one day at a time. And that, as we will see, was its own kind of witness. The second daughter is waiting. Her name was Luluwa, and her story cuts from the opposite direction. There are things that survive because someone powerful wanted them destroyed. And there are things that survive because they were true. And truth has a particular stubbornness that no amount of institutional pressure has ever been able to fully overcome. It goes underground. It moves through channels that official records do not track. It lives in the margins of manuscripts that were supposed to contain something else entirely. It whispers itself from mother to daughter, from elder to student, from the lips of a dying scribe to the ears of the young monk sitting at his feet in a cold stone room in the Ethiopian highlands, candle burning low, the night pressing in from all sides. Luluwa's name survived that way, quietly, persistently, refusing to disappear. She appears in the text known as the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, a document preserved most completely in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, translated into Arabic in the medieval period, but rooted in traditions that scholars trace back to the earliest centuries of the Common Era. This text is not in your standard Protestant Bible. It is not in the Catholic canon, but in Ethiopia, in the libraries of Axum and the monasteries of Debre Dama'o, that extraordinary monastery built on top of a sheer cliff that can only be reached by climbing a rope. These words have been read and copied and considered essential for longer than most Western entities have existed as political entities. And in those words, Luluwa stands. She was the twin sister of Cain. Ride that again and let it sit, Cain. The first murderer, the marked wanderer, the man whose very ground was cursed, had a twin sister, and her twin was Abel. Abel, the righteous one, the shepherd, the one whose offering God accepted, the one who was killed. So from the very beginning, Luluwa lived inside a symmetry that was also a wound. Her twin killed her other twin. In the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, the tradition is explicit. God had appointed that Cain should marry Abel's twin sister, Luluwa, and Abel should marry Cain's twin sister, Awan. This was the original arrangement. The daughters were not afterthoughts. They were part of the design, the way that even in the earliest generation, the lines of the human family were meant to weave together. Brother and sister, Cain's blood mixing with Abel's, the murderer's line braided with the victim's, as if God understood that the wound would need to be held inside the family rather than expelled from it, But Cain refused. He wanted Luluwa for himself, because Luluwa, the text tells us, was beautiful, more beautiful than Awan. And Cain, who had already demonstrated that he was a man capable of taking what he wanted, regardless of what it cost, looked at his twin sister and decided that the arrangement God had set was not the arrangement he would accept. He wanted her. He killed for reasons far less urgent than desire. And so Adam, trying to prevent another catastrophe, trying to hold together what was left of his family after the murder, Adam gave Awan to Cain instead. He gave Luluwa to Seth. And this is where the story splits, because this is the moment, recorded in the ancient Ge'ez text, preserved in those mountain libraries, carried through centuries of careful copying. This is the moment where the human family divides into its two great streams. Cain's line, Seth's line, the line of the wanderer and the line of the inheritor, the line of the city builder and the line of the mountain keeper, the line that would descend toward the valley and the line that would remain on the high ground. Luluwa went with Seth, and she carried something with her that Awan, for all her steadiness, could not carry, because Luluwa had been designated for righteousness from the beginning. She had been appointed, in the original design, for the brother who had been killed. She was, in a theological sense, that the Ethiopian tradition takes with complete seriousness, the bride of the slain. The woman who was meant for Abel, and who became instead the mother of the line that would carry his memory forward. She stood at the window of Seth's house one evening. Imagine it, the hills of that ancient world, the air cooling after a day of unrelenting sun, the distant sound of children, the smell of cooking fires, and looked toward the east, where Cain's city was a smear of smoke against the darkening sky. "Do you think of him?" Seth asked her. He was standing behind her. His voice was quiet. "Every day," Luluwa said. "He was my twin. The day he was born, I was born. We came into the world together. That does not simply stop." "And Cain?" She was silent for a long moment. "Cain was always going to take what he wanted," she said finally. "The question was never whether he would. The question was what would survive after he did." Seth put his hand on her shoulder. "You survived," he said. "We survived," she said, and she turned from the window. This is what the Ge'ez text preserves. Not the violence, not the spectacular rupture, but the afterward, the quiet, costly, ongoing work of people who have survived something terrible and chosen to continue. Luluwa did not spend her life defined by what Cain had done or what she had almost become. She built a family with Seth. She bore children whose names, Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, became the stepping stones of the righteous line, the line that would eventually produce Enoch the scribe, Methuselah the long-lived, and Noah the builder of arks. She was the root of that. A woman whose name almost disappeared from the record entirely. A woman who was given to the right man only because the wrong man had taken everything else. And she remained, steady, quietly. The way that roots remain, invisible underground, holding the tree upright through storms that would otherwise tear it loose from the earth. But here is the thing about roots. Even the most faithful roots cannot hold a tree if the storm is large enough. And a storm was coming to the children of Seth's line that Luluwa could not have imagined in the quiet of that first evening with her husband, looking east toward the smoke of Cain's city. It would not come from Cain's line. Not directly. It would come from above. From the place where the sons of God looked down at the daughters of men and saw that they were beautiful and could not look away. Breathe slowly now. Let the quiet of wherever you are settle around you like a blanket. The next part of the story rises before it resolves, but it always resolves. It always has. Rest in that. As we move forward, there comes a moment in the history of every falling thing when the falling has not yet begun, but the conditions for it are already complete. The stone is at the edge, the wind is rising, and everything that happens next has a kind of terrible inevitability, not because it was fated, not because free will had been removed from the equation, but because the accumulation of choices, generation after generation, had brought the world to a place where the next choice would be made by beings who had never been meant to make it. This is that moment. By the time we reach the generation that one Enoch is concerned with, the generation several hundred years after Seth, after Luluwa, after Awan, after the first cities and the first genealogies, and the first long accumulation of human life on the face of the young earth, the two lines had been living in proximity for long enough that the boundary between them had begun to blur. Cain's descendants had moved down from the eastern lands. Seth's descendants still lived on the holy mountain, the high ground, the place that the Cave of Treasures calls the Mountain of Paradise. A ridge or highland near the original garden, where Adam had instructed his children to remain separated from the cursed line, to keep themselves apart, to marry within their own people, to preserve the distinction between the two streams of humanity that God had allowed to form after the murder. For generations, they obeyed. For generations, the mountain held. But then, and the Guise manuscripts are specific about this, the Cave of Treasures traces the mechanism with uncomfortable precision. The daughters of Cain's line began to appear at the base of the mountain, not by accident. With intention, they came adorned. They came with music. They came with the particular knowledge, ancient even then, that beauty deployed with deliberateness is one of the most powerful forces the world contains. They sat at the foot of the mountain where Seth's sons could see them from above. They sang. They danced. They wore their hair loose, which was in that world a signal that carried weight, a statement made in the language of the body rather than the mouth. And Seth's sons looked down from the mountain and saw and wanted. This is the human half of the story, the earthly mechanism, the way that the line of the righteous, not through malice, not through deliberate rebellion, but through the oldest and most understandable of human hungers, began to descend from the mountain toward the valley, began to take wives from among the daughters of Cain, began to mix the two lines that Adam had spent his final years begging his children to keep apart. But one Enoch adds another dimension entirely, Because one Enoch does not let the daughters of men remain passive in this account, it does not render them simply as objects of desire. Beautiful women standing at the base of a mountain, instruments of a seduction they did not understand. The Ethiopian text is more complicated than that, more honest than that. And what it adds is the layer that changes everything. The sons of God, the watchers, the Erin, as they are called in Aramaic, the ones who were appointed to observe and guard the human world, were watching. They had been watching for a long time, and what they saw when they looked at the daughters of men was something that the text of 1 Enoch, chapter 6, verse 1, states with a directness that has made scholars uncomfortable for centuries. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, beautiful and comely daughters. Not the daughters of Seth specifically, not the daughters of Cain specifically, the daughters of men, the broad, sweeping category, the collective, the unnamed multitude of women who had been born into a world that was already moving toward catastrophe, who had grown up in the accumulated consequence of choices made before they were born, who had not asked to be beautiful, had not asked to be seen, had not asked to become the pivot point around which the entire cosmic order would fracture. They simply were, and they were seen. "Look," said one of the watchers. And here the Ethiopian tradition gives us a name. Semiaza, the leader, the one who would become the architect of the oath. Look at them. Look at what has been given to the sons of men. Look at what we are denied. The one beside him did not answer immediately. The air around them was the air of heaven, thin, bright, resonant with a quality that no human language captures fully, something between light and sound, something that hums at the edge of perception. "We were made for this watching," the second watcher said finally, "not for the taking. And yet," Semiaza said, "we have eyes." That sentence, that terrible simple sentence, "and yet we have eyes." It is the sentence of every being who has ever stood at the edge of a boundary they were not supposed to cross, and found that the boundary felt arbitrary in the presence of desire. It is the sentence of every moment when wanting becomes its own justification. When the mere existence of longing is taken as evidence that the longing should be fulfilled. The watchers had eyes, and the daughters of men were there, and the world, the quiet, ancient, still young world, with its red stone highlands, and its cooking fires, and its children running between the tents of their parents, that world did not yet know what was about to descend upon it. The daughters who had come to the base of the mountain did not know they were being watched from above, as well as from the ridge. They did not know that their beauty, ordinary, human, mortal beauty, the kind that fades and ages and eventually returns to the dust, had caught the attention of beings for whom beauty was not supposed to be a temptation at all. They were simply living the way ordinary people live, going about the small, urgent business of being human, grinding grain, carrying water, braiding hair in the evening while the light faded, telling stories to their children, about the beginning, about the garden, about the loss, about the great-grandfather who had been made from dust, and the great-grandmother who had listened to the wrong voice in the wrong tree. They were simply living, and the eyes of heaven had found them. Breathe here for a moment. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is beneath you. The world outside this story is still and safe. You are held. The daughters of men were not safe in that ancient moment. And yet the story of what happened to them is also, ultimately, a story about what heaven could not allow to continue, about what God heard when their children cried out, about how the machinery of divine response, once set in motion, does not stop. But before the response, there is one more woman to name, one more daughter to account for, the most dangerous of the four. The one whose particular gift, a gift she had done nothing wrong to possess, became the specific instrument through which the Watchers made their decision. Her name was Naamah, and she could sing. There are gifts that are too large for the world they are born into. Not because the gift itself is wrong, not because the one who carries it has done anything to corrupt it or weaponize it or aim it at a target it was never meant to reach, but because some gifts arrive in a world that is already tilted, already leaning toward the edge, and the gift becomes the last small weight that tips the balance. Naamah's gift was her voice, and the world she was born into was already leaning. She appears in Genesis 4:22, a single verse, a single mention, almost an afterthought tucked into the genealogy of Lamech, the seventh generation from Cain. Her brother was Tubal-Cain, the forger of every cutting instrument made of bronze and iron. Her father was Lamech, the first man in the biblical record to practice polygamy, a man who killed another man and then composed a song about it. A boastful, terrible song, the first recorded poem of human violence. Her mother was Zillah. She was Naamah, daughter of Lamech, sister of the ironworker, granddaughter of the cursed line, and that is all Genesis tells you. But the Ethiopian tradition does not stop there. The Cave of Treasures and the broader Ge'ez manuscript tradition, the texts that Ethiopian Orthodox scholars have been reading and cross-referencing and arguing over in their mountain monasteries for 16 centuries. These texts look at that single verse in Genesis and say, there is more here. There is always more. The name was preserved for a reason, and the reason is not the one you expect. In the ancient rabbinic tradition, preserved in texts like the Zohar and the earlier Midrashic literature, Naamah is sometimes identified as a seductress, the woman who, more than any other single figure, was responsible for the descent of the Watchers. Some traditions name her as the specific woman whom Semyaza desired. Some go further, saying that two of the Watchers, Shamdan and Aziel in certain versions, came to Earth specifically because of her. But the Ethiopian reading is more precise and more devastating, because the Ethiopian tradition does not say Naamah was merely beautiful. It says she could sing. Not in the ordinary way that people sing. The way that Seth's daughters sang in the evenings on the mountain, simple melodic prayers that rose with the smoke of the cooking fires toward a sky that was listening. Naamah sang in the way that the Cave of Treasures describes as beyond what the ear can hold without being changed by it. Her voice carried something that was not simply sound. It was a kind of petition, unintentional, unpremeditated, innocent, that moved through the air like light moves through water, bending as it traveled, arriving somewhere other than where it began. She sang the songs of Cain's line, not holy songs, not the psalms of the mountain people, the prayers of Seth's descendants who had been taught by their fathers to keep their faces turned toward the God of Adam. Naamah sang the songs of the valley, the songs of people who had been moving away from the mountain for 7 generations, songs of human desire, songs of the body, songs that celebrated the things of this world, the warmth of fire, the taste of food, the weight of a hand on a shoulder in the dark, human songs, fully, completely, unapologetically human. And the watchers heard her. Imagine what that was like for them. Beings of light and fire and ancient obedience, stationed above the world they were appointed to guard, who had been watching human beings since the beginning, watching them struggle and grieve and love and bury each other and begin again. Beings who understood human experience from the outside the way a scholar understands a language they have studied but never spoken. And then Naamah began to sing, and the outside became inside, the understanding became feeling. And feeling, for a being who had never felt before, is the most dangerous thing in the universe. "What is that?" one of the watchers asked. He was not asking about the sound. He was asking about the thing the sound had opened inside him. The hollow place that had not existed before the song began, and that now, since the song had begun, ached with a want he had no name for. "It is a woman singing," said the one beside him. "I know what it is," the first watcher said. "I am asking what it is." Neither of them had an answer, because there is no answer to that question, not a clean one, not one that resolves the ache rather than deepening it. The experience of hearing something beautiful and being unable to stop wanting it, that is one of the oldest and most human of all conditions. And the watchers, watching from above, were discovering it for the first time. They were discovering it through Naamah. Now understand what Naamah herself was doing in this moment. She was not standing at the base of the mountain, deliberately adorned, deliberately performing for an audience she knew was watching. That was the daughters of Cain's line from the earlier generation. The deliberate seduction, the calculated display. Naamah was not doing that. Naamah was simply singing in her own courtyard in the evening, for herself or for her family or for no one in particular, the way that people who have great gifts sometimes use those gifts in private, unself-consciously, without performance, without intention, without any awareness that the sound is traveling further than the walls of the courtyard. She did not know she was being heard by anything other than the night air. She did not know that her voice was moving upward through layers of sky that she could not see, reaching ears that had no business hearing human music, landing in the hollow places of beings who had guarded the world since before she was born. She was innocent. Completely. That is the thing that makes this part of the story so difficult to hold and so important to hold at the same time. Because innocence does not protect you from consequence. Innocence does not guarantee that your gift will land safely. Innocence does not mean that the world will treat what you are as what it actually is. A gift, a grace, a beautiful, ordinary human thing, rather than as a catalyst for something you never intended to set in motion. Naamah sang, and in the councils above the world, in the place where the watchers gathered, to report and confer and carry out their appointed duties. Semyaza turned to the 200 who were with him and said something that the Book of Enoch records with a plainness that is more chilling than any elaboration could be. He said, "Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men and beget us children, 200 voices. 200 ancient beings who had existed since before the human world began. 200 pairs of eyes that had watched the rise and fall of every generation since Adam. And they said yes. They said yes because of what Naamah's voice had opened inside them. They said yes because desire, once admitted, does not negotiate. They said yes because the daughters of men were beautiful, and the world was young, and the boundary between heaven and earth felt. In that terrible luminous moment, like a formality rather than a law, but it was not a formality. It was a law, and the breaking of it would cost the world everything. Naamah did not know what her voice had done. She finished her song as the stars appeared above the valley of her father's people, the stars coming out, one by one, the way they always had, the way they always would, indifferent and eternal and impossibly far away. She went inside. She did not know that the night above her was no longer the same night it had been when she began to sing. Something had been set in motion. Something that would not stop until heaven itself intervened, wrecked now in the quiet space between what was set in motion and what came next. That space is where you are tonight, held between the beginning of the falling and the arrival of the response. And the response, as we will see, was not absent. It was never absent. It was simply gathering the way that storms gather, silently, slowly, with a completeness and a purpose that the lightning, when it finally comes, makes suddenly, blindingly clear. There are places on this earth where something happened that the ground never forgot. Mount Hermon is one of those places. It stands at the northern edge of what was ancient Canaan, a massif of gray limestone and cedar forest, snow-capped even in summer, its peak rising to nearly 3,000 meters above the valley floor. On clear days you can see it from the Sea of Galilee, a white crown above the horizon, serene and enormous and indifferent to the smallness of everything below it. The local populations in antiquity considered it sacred. They built temples on its slopes. They left offerings at its summit. They knew, with the particular knowledge that ancient peoples had about certain mountains, a knowledge that was less intellectual than physical, felt in the sternum rather than understood in the mind. They knew that this was a place where the membrane between worlds was thin. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. Because according to one Enoch, the Ethiopian text, the Ge'ez manuscript tradition, the same account that 11 fragments at Qumran confirmed word for word it was on Mount Hermon that the 200 watchers descended. It was on Mount Hermon that they gathered on the summit in the cold, thin air above the tree line, with the stars close enough to touch and the world spread below them like a map of everything they were about to change forever. And it was on Mount Hermon that they swore the oath. This detail matters more than it might seem. An oath in the ancient world was not simply a promise. It was a binding of the self, a calling of the divine as witness, a declaration made in the presence of forces larger than the one speaking, a severing of the possibility of retreat. To swear an oath was to remove the exit, to say, I am committed beyond the point where commitment can be walked back. Whatever comes next, I have already agreed to it. Semyaza knew they needed the oath, because without it he knew what would happen. He knew the hesitation that lives in every being capable of understanding consequence. He knew that when the moment of crossing came, when the summit was behind them and the descent had begun, and the valley floor was rising to meet them, some of them would stop. Some of them would remember what they were. Some of them would turn back. So he called them together on the summit of Hermon and said to them, with the cold mountain wind moving through their ranks, I fear that perhaps you will not agree to do this thing, and I alone will pay the penalty for this great sin. Listen to that sentence. He was afraid. The leader of the rebellion was afraid. Not of God, not yet. Not in the way that fear of God operates as wisdom, but afraid of being alone in his transgression. Afraid of being the only one. Afraid that the desire he carried would be a solitary shame rather than a shared condition. This is one of the oldest human fears dressed in the clothing of an angel. The fear of being alone in your falling. And so 200 answered him. They answered with an oath. They said, and one Enoch records this with the precision of a legal document, which is exactly what it was. They said, let us all swear an oath and bind one another with curses not to alter this plan, but to carry out this plan effectively. They swore, all 200, on the summit of the mountain that the world below them still considers sacred. And then they descended. The text of 1 Enoch gives us their names. Not all 200, but the leaders, the chiefs of tens, the captains of the cohort that was about to do the thing that had never been done. Semyaza, who led them, Arachiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barachiel, Asael, Armaros, Batariel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapiel, Satariel, Turiel, Yomiel, Sariel. 19 names recorded. 19 chiefs of a company of 200, and each name carries its own weight, its own history, its own specific contribution to the catastrophe that followed, because it was not only the union with the daughters of men that the Watchers brought to the world. It was knowledge, it was technology, it was secrets that human beings were not supposed to have yet, not because God was withholding them maliciously, but because there is a sequence to learning, a natural order of readiness, and what the Watchers taught, the human world bypassed that sequence entirely. Azazel taught men to make swords and shields, and breastplates. He taught them to work bronze and iron into instruments of war. He taught women the art of beautification, eye paint, ornaments, the cutting of stones, things that seem small from this distance, but that the text of 1 Enoch treats as a kind of corruption of natural innocence, an acceleration of vanity and desire in a world that was not yet ready to manage those forces without being consumed by them. Semyaza and his companions taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabeel taught the knowledge of the signs. Tamiel taught the science of the clouds. Asradel taught the motion of the moon. Imagine a world that had been learning slowly, organically, at the pace of generations, where each discovery was earned through trial and error, through the accumulation of lived experience, through the patient transmission of knowledge from parent to child over centuries. And now imagine that world receiving, all at once, the full weight of knowledge that it had not earned, had not grown into, had not developed the wisdom to hold safely. It is like giving a child who has never held fire a furnace. The warmth is real, the danger is realer, and the world did not have the wisdom. It took the knowledge. It took the weapons and the enchantments and the astronomical secrets and the cosmetics and the metallurgy, and it used them the way that any people use power that arrives before the moral development to match it. Hungrily, carelessly, with a kind of intoxicated recklessness that felt like freedom and was actually acceleration toward the edge. But this is the part of the oath that the text dwells on longest, not the knowledge, the women, because the daughters of men, those unnamed, collective, beautiful daughters who had been living their ordinary human lives below the mountain, were taken as wives. The text is explicit. The word used is not courtship. It is not mutual agreement in the modern sense. It is taking. The choosing and the taking of women by beings who had descended from above specifically to possess what they wanted. And the women bore children. And this is where the story darkens past anything that could be called merely transgressive, because the children were not human. They were the Nephilim, the ones whose name in Hebrew carries the weight of falling, Naphal, to fall, the fallen ones, or the ones who cause others to fall, the etymology debated but the meaning unmistakable. Enormous, violent, consuming. The text says they grew to 300 cubits, a number that is almost certainly symbolic, a way of saying, beyond the scale of anything the human world was built to contain. They ate everything the human population could produce. And when the food ran out, they turned on the humans themselves. "We cannot feed them," a woman said, a daughter of men, standing in the doorway of a house that had once been full and was now nearly empty, her voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for so long that fear has stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like weather. "We cannot stop them either," the man beside her said. She looked at him. They both knew it was true. The earth groaned under the weight of what had been borne upon it. And somewhere in the sky, above the groaning earth, in the place where heaven meets the highest air, where the membrane between the created order and the one who created it is thinner than anywhere else. A sound was rising, not the sound of Naamah's singing, not the sound of the oath on the mountain, the sound of crying, human crying, the accumulated grief of a world that had been given knowledge before wisdom, power before peace, and children it could neither feed nor survive. That sound traveled upward, through layers of sky, through the celestial distances, and it arrived. The text of 1 Enoch says it plainly, without ornamentation, with the simple declarative confidence of a document that knows it is recording something that actually happened. And then Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Uriel looked down from heaven and saw the quantity of blood that was being shed on earth, and all the iniquity being done on earth. And they said to one another, the earth made without inhabitant cries, the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven. The cry had been heard. Rest in that for a moment. Let the weight of it settle slowly, the way snow settles, quietly, completely, covering everything. The crying was heard. It was always going to be heard, because that is the nature of the one who made the world. Not distant, not indifferent, not the absentee landlord of a property he had forgotten. Present, listening. And now, at the edge of the worst thing the young world had yet produced, moving. There are moments in history when the world crosses a threshold it cannot uncross, not gradually, not with warning signs that accumulate over decades until someone finally reads them correctly. But suddenly, the way a bridge gives way, the way a river breaks its banks, the way a body reaches the limit of what it can absorb and simply stops absorbing. The threshold is crossed in a single moment, and everything on the other side of that moment is different from everything that came before it. The birth of the Nephilim was that moment. Before them, the world was broken in the way that all human worlds are broken, through murder and jealousy and the slow erosion of the distance between what people know is right and what they actually do. The kind of brokenness that grieves God, but does not require the fundamental restructuring of creation to address. The kind that can be met with prophets, with warnings, with the patient, long suffering of a creator who has not yet exhausted the possibilities of persuasion. After them, the world was broken in a different way entirely, in a way that had no human solution, in a way that would require an answer from above. But before we reach the answer, before the Archangels receive their orders and the machinery of divine response begins to move, we need to stay here for a moment. In the world the Nephilim made, in the experience of the women who bore them and the people who lived alongside them, and the earth itself that held them, groaning under a weight it had never been designed to carry. Because this part of the story is not abstract. It is not theological. It is human. It is the story of what happened to ordinary people, to the daughters of men who had been taken as wives, to their neighbors and their children, and the communities that had been, before the descent of the Watchers, simply living when the thing they had been given to bear turned out to be beyond the capacity of any human woman to bear alone. The text of 1 Enoch, chapter 7. describes what the women brought into the world with a specificity that is almost clinical in its detail. The women became pregnant. They bore great giants. The giants devoured all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and began to devour the men themselves. And they drank the blood, and they sinned against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and they devoured one another's flesh and drank the blood from it. Read that sequence slowly and let the horror of it accumulate the way the text intends it to accumulate. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but as testimony. As the careful, sober accounting of a scribe who wanted the record to reflect the full weight of what the world had become. Who wanted no one, reading it centuries later, to be able to say, well, surely it was not that bad. It was that bad. It was worse than that bad. And the women who had borne these children were still alive inside this world. Think about them for a moment. Think about what it means to carry a child. The months of it. The way the body reorganizes itself around the new life. The way every system recalibrates. The way that the weight of it becomes the center of everything. The ancient world had no medical intervention, no clinical distance, no epidurals, no scheduled cesarean sections. Birth in the ancient world was the most dangerous ordinary thing that women did. Women died in childbirth regularly. Women knew they might die, and they bore children anyway, because the alternative was the end of the human story, and the human story insisted on continuing. The daughters of men bore the Nephilim the same way, in pain, in danger, in the complete vulnerability of a body doing the most extraordinary thing a body can do. And what emerged was not what a human mother is built to hold, not what her arms could contain, not what her eyes could meet without a terror that went deeper than the ordinary terror of new motherhood. What emerged was immense and violent and hungry in a way that hunger is not supposed to work, not the hunger of a newborn that cries and is fed and is comforted and sleeps, but a hunger that had no satisfaction point, that ate and ate and ate and was never full, that looked at the world around it and saw only more to consume. One of the women, the text does not name her, she is one of the collective, one of the daughters of men, sat at the edge of what had once been her village in the hours before dawn, when the sky was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, and the world was briefly quiet. And she looked at her hands. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. A woman beside her put her hand over hers. "You could not have known," the second woman said. The first woman looked at her. Her eyes were very still, very dark, the eyes of someone who has been through something that has burned away the capacity for ordinary expression. "I knew something," she said. "I knew it was not right. I knew when he came to me that what he was asking for was not a thing that was meant to be asked for. But the world had already become so strange by then, so large and so strange, and I was so small inside it." The second woman did not answer. There was nothing to answer, because she was right. The world had become too large and too strange for ordinary human resistance to navigate. The Watchers had not descended into a world that was firmly ordered, clearly bounded, spiritually robust, They had descended into a world that was already confused, already mixing the two bloodlines, already losing the thread of the holy mountain, already forgetting the instructions that Adam had given and that Seth had tried to preserve, and that each subsequent generation had preserved a little less faithfully than the one before. They had descended into a world that was leaning, and now the world was falling. The earth, and this is the image that stays with you when you read the Ethiopian account, the image that the Ge'ez manuscripts preserve with a vividness that has not faded in 2,000 years. The earth itself cried out, not metaphorically, not as a poetic device. The text means it literally. The ground, the soil, the ancient red stone of the world. It cried. It raised a voice. It sent up a sound that had no human throat to form it, and yet was unmistakably a petition, unmistakably a cry for help, unmistakably the sound of a creation straining under a weight it had never been designed to hold. And the cry traveled upward, through the layers of sky above the burning cities, above the devoured villages, above the women sitting in the pre-dawn dark with shaking hands, above the bodies of the men who had been consumed, above the strange, enormous children who slept without peace and woke without mercy, upward through all of that, to the place where the Archangels kept their watch. Now here is the thing that the Ethiopian tradition holds with particular insistence. The thing that separates the Ge'ez reading of this story from the abbreviated Western version that most people encounter, if they encounter it at all. The cry was not ignored. It was not filed away. It was not met with the distant, procedural acknowledgement of a bureaucracy that has received a complaint and will process it in due course. It arrived, and it landed, and the ones who heard it were moved by it in the way that only beings of pure divine function can be moved, not with the paralysis of grief, not with the helpless sorrow of people who feel deeply but cannot act, but with the immediate, purposeful, laser-focused movement of those who were made to respond. Michael heard it, Gabriel heard it, Raphael heard it, Uriel heard it. 4 archangels, 4 responses, and the response, when it came, would address not just the immediate catastrophe, but the root of it. The oath on the mountain, the descent, the knowledge given too early, the children who could not be sustained, the women who had borne them, the earth that was crying, and the watchers who had sworn their names to a plan they could no longer undo even if they had wanted to. It would address all of it. But first, and this is the detail that the Ethiopian text lingers on, the detail that feels most true because it is the least spectacular. First, the archangels looked. They simply looked down through the layers of sky, through the smoke and the noise and the chaos of a world coming apart at its foundations, and they saw exactly what was there, all of it, without flinching, without turning away. The earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven. They heard it, and they moved. Settle now into the quiet of that movement, the gathering of response in the places above the world, the purposeful turning of the divine machinery toward the broken thing below. You are held inside that same attention tonight. The same eyes that saw the earth crying in that ancient darkness see you now in this quiet, in this rest, and they have not looked away. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of attention. You have felt it, perhaps, in moments when someone you trusted was listening to you so completely that the air between you changed quality. When the usual background noise of the world, the small ambient hum of things continuing regardless of whether anyone notices them, seemed to recede. When the space between your words and the ears of the one receiving them felt charged, alive, specific. When you understood, in your body before your mind caught up, that you were being truly heard. That is, the silence that gathered above the world in the moment that the cry of the earth reached the place where the 4 archangels kept their watch. And what happened next? What the Book of Enoch records in chapters 9 and 10 with a precision and a grandeur that have made scholars reach for superlatives across 3,000 years of engagement with the text. What happened next is the part of this story that the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition treats not merely as ancient history, but as living theology, as a document of how God actually works, as evidence preserved in ge'ez on vellum in mountain monasteries, that the divine response to human suffering is not silence, not distance, not the elegant indifference of a creator who has moved on to other projects. It is movement, purposeful, specific, named movement. 4 archangels, 4 assignments, each one precise. Each one calibrated to address a specific dimension of the catastrophe below. Each one a demonstration that the God of the Ethiopian Bible, the God of the full canon, the one that includes Enoch and Jubilees and the Cave of Treasures alongside Genesis and Psalms, is not a God who observes from a safe distance. He is a God who sends. Let us begin with what they saw. The text of 1 Enoch, chapter 9, tells us that Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Uriel looked down from heaven and saw the quantity of blood being shed on earth, saw the iniquity, saw the Nephilim devouring and consuming and destroying, saw the secrets of the watchers being used, the metallurgy, the enchantments, the astronomical knowledge, the arts of war, used not to elevate humanity, but to accelerate its destruction. And they said to one another, "The earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven." There is something in that phrase that deserves to be held. The earth made without inhabitant, not the earth full of people crying, not the human voices rising from the villages and the valleys, but the earth itself, the ground, the stone, the soil, the ancient body of the created world, crying as if it had been emptied, as if the weight of what was happening on its surface had pressed it past the point of endurance until the earth itself was making the sound of a place that has been abandoned by what it was made to hold. This is not poetry, or rather, it is poetry in the way that all true testimony is poetry. It is language reaching for an experience that ordinary description cannot contain. And what it is reaching for is this: the world had become uninhabitable, not physically, not yet, not in the way the flood would soon make it uninhabitable, but spiritually, cosmically. In terms of the original intention of creation, in that sense, the world had already been emptied of what it was made to hold, and the four archangels could not look at that and do nothing. Now let us name them properly, because names matter in this tradition. Ge'ez is a language in which names carry their meaning openly, where the word and the thing it refers to are less separate than in English, where the name of a being tells you something essential about the nature of that being. Michael. Mikael in Hebrew. Who is like God? The name is a question, and the question is rhetorical, and the rhetorical answer is no one. No one is like God. Michael is the archangel of that answer, the one who stands in the place where the distinction between the divine and everything else is most sharply drawn. In 1 Enoch, Michael receives the assignment that requires the greatest authority: the binding of the Watcher leaders, the imprisonment of the ones who had sworn the oath on Hermon, the containment of the rebellion at its source. His assignment, as given in chapter 10, is to bind Semyaza and his companions, to cast them into the valleys of the earth, to seal them in the darkness under the hills until the day of judgment, that final reckoning that the Ethiopian text treats not as a metaphor, but as a literal future event, as fixed in the calendar of heaven as the rising of the sun. "Go, Michael," the voice said. And here I am, rendering what the text records in the formal register of divine instruction. Bind Semyaza and his associates who have united themselves with women's, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. When their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment. 70 generations, not a metaphor, a sentence, the length of the sentence calibrated to the scale of the crime. Now, Gabriel, the strength of God, the power of God, the one in whom divine force takes its most immediate and kinetic form. Gabriel's assignment in this account is not the binding of the Watchers. Gabriel is sent to deal with the children, with the Nephilim, with the enormous, violent, hungry offspring of the union that should never have happened. And the instruction is one of the most difficult passages in the entire Enochic literature to sit with. "Go, Gabriel," the text records, "to the bastards and the reprobates, and to the children of fornication. Destroy the children of the Watchers from among the sons of men. Send them against one another, that they may destroy each other in battle." There is no softening this. There is no theological maneuver that makes the instruction comfortable. The children, those immense, violent, consuming children who had been born without asking to be born into a body that the world could not hold, were to be destroyed through each other. The violence that they had turned outward against the human population would be turned inward, directed between themselves, until they had consumed each other the way they had consumed everything else. "Why?" Gabriel asked, and here I am, filling the silence that the text creates with a silence of its own. Because the text does not give us Gabriel's internal response. It gives us only the instruction and the compliance. But in the Ethiopian tradition, In the commentaries and the homilies that the monks of Lalibela and Axum have been writing about these passages for 16 centuries, there is a theological understanding that holds the difficulty without dissolving it. The Nephilim were not salvageable. Not because they were irredeemably evil in a metaphysical sense, but because they were structurally incompatible with the world as it had been made. They were the offspring of a union between two orders of being that were never meant to produce offspring together, and the offspring, bearing the nature of both orders without fully belonging to either, could not be integrated into a creation that was built on the distinction between them. They were not punished. They were unmade. There is a difference. And the souls that came from them. This is the part that the Ethiopian tradition treats with particular gravity, the part that makes the Nephilim story not merely a historical catastrophe, but a cosmological one. The souls that came from them became something else, something that the ancient world called by various names, most of them translated as evil spirits or unclean spirits. Beings without bodies, without the grounding in flesh and earth that makes ordinary experience possible, wandering the world seeking re-entry into the physical order they had been removed from. This is, in the Ethiopian theological reading, the origin of demonic spirits, not a metaphor, a genealogy. Now Raphael, the healing of God, the medicine of God, the divine response to damage. Raphael's assignment is the one that is easiest to understand and perhaps the most personally immediate of the four. He is sent to heal the earth. Heal the earth which the angels have corrupted, the instruction reads. Proclaim the healing of the earth, that the plague may be healed, and that all the children of men may not perish because of the mystery of all the things that the watchers have done. Raphael is sent not to judge, not to bind, not to destroy. Raphael is sent to the wound itself, to the groaning earth, to the scarred soil, to the world that had been corrupted by knowledge given too early and desire expressed without boundary. He is the Archangel of restoration, of the long, patient work of healing that begins even before the catastrophe has fully run its course. The earth will be healed. That is the promise, not after everything is resolved, not after the flood has come and gone, and Noah has emerged from the ark, and the rainbow has appeared. Now, in the middle of the catastrophe, before the worst of it has yet arrived, Raphael is already moving toward the wound. And finally, Uriel di Ariel, the flame of God, the fire of God, the light that illuminates what would otherwise remain hidden. Uriel's assignment is the most intimate of the four. Not the binding of leaders, not the destruction of giants, not the healing of the earth. Uriel is sent to a man, a specific man, a man who was living on the edge of the catastrophe, who had been born into the righteous line of Seth and Luluwa, who had spent his life walking so close to God that the text says God took him. Not that he died, but that God took him, which is a different thing entirely, which is what happens when the distance between a human soul and its creator collapses to zero. Uriel was sent to Enoch. Go, Uriel, the instruction reads, and say to him in my name, go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide yourself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it. Tell Enoch, tell him to tell Noah the chain of testimony, the passing of the word from the divine to the human, through the human who was closest to the divine. This is how the warning travels, not in fire from the sky, not in a voice that all 8 billion people on earth can hear simultaneously, but through one man, chosen for his proximity, tasked with his knowing, sent to another man who would need to know in order to survive. Enoch, the scribe, the walker, the man who had been taken and who was about to be sent back. His face when Uriel arrived. The soft white light of the Archangel filling the room where Enoch sat with his scrolls, the smell of cedar and old vellum, and the particular nighttime stillness of a world on the verge of ending. His face was very still. He had known something was coming. He had known for a long time. Is it time? Enoch asked. Uriel looked at him with the eyes of a being who carries fire and has learned to be gentle with it. It is time, Uriel said. Enoch closed the scroll he had been reading. He set it on the table. He folded his hands, and he waited to receive the full weight of what he had been chosen to carry. Let that image rest in you now, the stillness of it, the readiness. A man sitting in a quiet room, scrolls around him, a light entering that was not the light of lamps, and receiving, without running from it, the weight of what he had been made for. You do not need to run from what you were made for, not tonight, not ever. The weight of your particular calling, whatever it is, however ordinary it looks from the outside, is exactly the weight you were built to carry. Ret in that, the Archangels have their assignments. Enoch has been found, and the story is moving now toward the place where the scribe of heaven is, sent as a messenger to the very beings whose crime set all of this in motion. There are people in every generation who are asked to carry a word that no one wants to hear, not because they are the strongest, not because they are the most fearless, not because they have somehow transcended the ordinary human experience of not wanting to stand in front of a room full of people, or in this case, a company of fallen celestial beings, and say, what you have done is wrong, and there is no appeal, and the verdict has already been handed down. They are chosen for a different reason. They are chosen because they are close enough to the source of the word that the word will not be distorted in the carrying of it. Because proximity to truth is not the same as invulnerability to pain. It is simply the condition of being able to hold the truth without letting it change shape on the way from the mouth to the ear. Enoch was that person, and God called him, not with a dramatic summons, not with fire and thunder and the kind of spectacular divine intervention that makes a good story, but rarely produces the kind of character required for a genuinely difficult assignment. The text of 1 Enoch describes the calling of Enoch with a quietness that feels deliberate, as if the text itself is demonstrating what it is describing. A man who walks with God is not a man who is constantly overwhelmed by the presence of God. He is a man who has learned to move through that presence the way a person moves through familiar rooms in their own house, with ease, with awareness. Without the paralysis of perpetual astonishment, Enoch walked with God, and one day God spoke. "Enoch," the voice said, not loud, not from a burning bush or a whirlwind or a pillar of cloud and fire, just the voice in the room among the scrolls, where Enoch had spent his life writing down what he witnessed and witnessed what he wrote down. "Here I am," Enoch said. He always said that. It was the answer of the available person, the one who has not hidden, not qualified their presence, not made conditions on their showing up. Just, "Here I am. Take what you need." And what God needed from Enoch in that moment was something extraordinary, and also something very specific, and also something that, if Enoch had been a different kind of man, might have caused him to set down conditions, to negotiate, to say, "Surely there is someone better suited to this than a scribe, who writes by lamplight in a room full of old parchment." God needed Enoch to go to the Watchers, to go to the beings who had descended from the summit of Hermon and taken the daughters of men and fathered the Nephilim and taught human beings the secrets of war and enchantment and cosmetics and astronomical manipulation. To go to those beings, the ones now watching their enormous children consume and destroy and turn the world into something unrecognizable, and deliver their verdict. God needed Enoch to tell them that their petition for forgiveness had been denied because the Watchers had sent a petition. This is the part of the story that the abbreviated Western tradition almost entirely overlooks, but that the Ethiopian text treats as crucial, as theologically essential, as the hinge on which the whole second half of the account turns. The Watchers were afraid. After the oath on Hermon, after the descent, after the Nephilim had been born, and the world had begun to come apart, the Watchers looked at what they had made, and they were afraid. Not repentant. Not in the deep sense of repentance that involves a genuine turning of the will away from the thing that caused the damage, but afraid. The way that people are often afraid when consequences begin to materialize, when the abstract calculation of desire versus prohibition becomes suddenly concrete, when the thing you wanted and the cost of wanting it are standing in the same room together, and you cannot any longer pretend they are separate. The Watchers looked at the world below, and they saw the Archangels moving. They saw the judgments being prepared, and they were afraid. So they went to Enoch. They went to him. The text says this with a bluntness that is almost comic in its reversal of the expected power dynamic. They went to the mortal scribe, the man of dust and breath, the one whose lifespan was a vapor compared to their eternity, and they asked him to write a petition on their behalf and carry it before God. They asked the man to intercede for the angels. Think about the strangeness of that for a moment. Beings who had been stationed above the human world, who had been given the role of watching over human beings, who had looked at human beings and seen them as objects of desire rather than subjects of care. Those beings were now asking a human being to help them, to speak for them, to use the particular proximity to God that Enoch had developed through a lifetime of faithful walking to perhaps soften what was coming. And Enoch, because he was Enoch, said yes. He wrote the petition. He took their words, their plea for mercy, their acknowledgement that what they had done was wrong, their appeal to the character of the God they had sinned against, and he shaped them into the formal language of supplication, and he read the petition aloud, and he fell asleep with the words still in his mouth. And while he slept, God spoke to him. The vision came in layers, the way the most significant revelations always come, not in a single blinding flash, but in a deepening, a progressive disclosure, one layer of meaning revealing another beneath it, the way that you peel back the surface of a text you have read many times and find, each time, something new waiting underneath. In the vision, Enoch was carried to the heights. He saw the house of crystal and fire. He saw the walls of that house, walls of crystal, floor of crystal, ceiling of crystal, and inside the ceiling, a fire that burned without consuming, a fire that was nothing like the fires of the world below. He saw the throne. He saw the one who sat upon it, and here the text reaches the outer edge of what language can do. It says, "His raiment was like the appearance of the sun and whiter than snow." It says, "The angels could not approach and stand before the glory." And from the midst of that glory, the voice came, not angry, not triumphant, not with the satisfaction of a judge who has been waiting for this moment, but with the gravity of a verdict that is also a grief, because the one handing down the judgment is not unmoved by the ones being judged. He made them. He knows what they were before they fell. He knows the distance between what they were and what they chose to become. And the verdict was this: "Go and say to the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you were in heaven, but all the mysteries of heaven were not revealed to you, and you, harden of heart, have known a worthless mystery. In the hardness of your heart you have recounted it to women." Through this mystery, the women and the men cause evil to multiply on the earth. And then, you were in heaven, and no mystery was hidden from you. But a worthless mystery you have known. This you have made known to women in the hardness of your heart. And through these mysteries, women and men work much evil on earth. And then the sentence, final, complete, without appeal: you will have no peace. 3 words, in Ge'ez. In the ancient manuscripts of the Ethiopian monasteries, those 3 words carry a weight that translation can gesture toward, but never fully reproduce. You will have no peace. Not you will be destroyed, though destruction is coming. Not you will be imprisoned, though imprisonment is coming. But the thing that is being taken from them, the thing that is named as the specific loss they will carry, is peace, because peace is what they took from the world. The earth had been crying. The daughters of men had been sitting in the pre-dawn dark with shaking hands. The Nephilim had been consuming everything. And the world had had no peace since the moment the 200 swore their oath on the cold summit of Hermon. You took peace from the world, you will have no peace. The symmetry of it is exact. The justice of it is not punitive but structural, a removal of the thing that was removed. a mirroring of the loss, a verdict that fits the crime with the precision of something that was designed from the beginning to hold. Enoch carried the verdict back. He went to the Watchers, those immense, luminous, terrified beings who had asked a mortal man to speak for them, and he told them what God had said. The text does not record their response in elaborate detail. It records their silence. And silence, in the world of one Enoch, is its own kind of language. Silence is what falls when a being reaches the end of its ability to argue with reality. When the petition has been denied, and the verdict has been delivered, and there is nothing left to say that would change anything. When the distance between what you hoped and what is has become final. They were silent, and in their silence, Enoch stood, a man, a mortal man with mortal breath and mortal hands, and a lifespan that was a breath compared to theirs, standing in the silence of fallen angels. Holding the word he had been given, having delivered it faithfully, having carried it without distortion from the source to the recipients, through the vision and the crystal house, and the fire that burned without consuming, all the way back to the valley where the 200 stood in the ruins of the choice they could not unchoose. He did not gloat, he did not grieve. He simply stood, the way that faithful people stand when they have done what they were asked to do, not taller than they were before, not inflated by the importance of the assignment, not diminished by the difficulty of it, just standing, upright, present, having been used for what they were made for. This is what faithfulness looks like from the inside. Not triumphant, not tragic, just present, just standing in the silence after the word has landed. And then Enoch turned, and he walked back toward the world of men, toward his family, toward the son who was waiting for him, toward the conversation that would be, though neither of them knew it yet, the last real conversation they would have before God took him fully, took him finally, into the place where the walking with God that Enoch had been doing his whole life simply continued, without interruption, without the parentheses of death. The silence behind him was sealed, the verdict was delivered, the machinery of the divine response was fully in motion. And the world, the groaning, crying, consumed, corrupted, still beloved world, was moving now toward its ending and its beginning, toward the flood that was always coming, toward the mercy that was already being prepared inside the judgment, toward the one man in the line of Seth and Luluwa, who was about to receive the most unusual set of building instructions in the history of the human race, writ in the stillness of that turning now, the silence that follows a verdict. The particular quality of air in a room after something final has been said and received, and the participants have begun to move toward what comes next. It is not an empty silence, it is a full one, full of what has been decided, full of what is being prepared, full of the particular peace that exists, always, underneath everything, in the knowledge that the world is not ungoverned, that the cry was heard, that the verdict was delivered, that the machinery is moving. That peace is yours tonight. Breathe it in slowly. Let it settle. There are endings that arrive like ambushes, without warning, without the courtesy of a sign that something final is approaching. One moment the world is as it has always been, familiar, textured, full of the ordinary noise of people going about the business of being alive, and the next moment it is not. The ambush ending is the one that leaves survivors standing in the wreckage asking, "How did we not see this coming? How was there no signal? How did the world manage to look so normal right up until the moment it stopped being normal entirely? And then there are endings that were always coming, that were written into the logic of events from the moment the first wrong choice was made, that accumulated through generations of smaller choices, each one bending the trajectory a little further until the arc of it was unmistakable to anyone willing to look at it honestly. These endings do not ambush you. They arrive with the terrible patience of something that has been traveling toward you for a very long time. And when they finally arrive, the honest response is not shock. It is recognition. The flood was that kind of ending. It had been coming since Cain raised his hand against Abel. It had been coming since Awan was given to the marked man and carried his bloodline forward into the world of the first city. It had been coming since Luluwa stood at the window of Seth's house and watched the smoke of Cain's settlement on the eastern horizon. It had been coming since the daughters of men sat at the base of the mountain, and the sons of Seth looked down and wanted. It had been coming since Naamah sang in her courtyard, and the watchers heard something in her voice that they had no framework to resist. It had been coming since the oath on Hermon, since the descent, since the births, since the consuming and the devouring and the crying of the earth that reached the ears of the Archangels. It had always been coming, and Noah knew it. Not in the way that we sometimes imagine foreknowledge working, as a sudden blinding revelation, a single dramatic moment when the veil is pulled back and the future is laid out in full. Noah's knowing was slower than that. It was the knowing of a man who had been watching the world deteriorate his entire life, and who had refused to stop watching, refused to look away, refused to adopt the comfortable numbness that his neighbors had chosen as their primary coping strategy. He watched. He saw what the world had become. And when Uriel came to Enoch, and Enoch passed the word to Noah, "Hide yourself, a deluge is coming, the whole earth will be destroyed." Prepare, Noah received it not as news but as confirmation, as the articulation of something his bones had already known. "I know," Noah said when Enoch found him. Enoch looked at his descendant, this man several generations removed, this fruit of the line of Seth and Luluwa, this inheritor of the bloodline that had chosen the mountain and the separation and the long, slow, faithful preservation of the distinction between the holy and the cursed. And he saw in Noah's face the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a knowledge they could not yet speak. "You know," Enoch said. "It was not a question. I have known for years," Noah said. "The world is not recoverable. I have watched it. Every generation further than the last. The things the watchers taught, the weapons, the enchantments, they did not stay with the ones who were first taught them. They spread, they multiplied, they found their way into hands that had even less wisdom to hold them than the first hands. And the Nephilim. He stopped, looked at the ground, looked up again. There is no human solution to the Nephilim. No, Enoch said, there is not. They stood together for a moment. In the particular stillness of two men who understand each other completely and have nothing left to negotiate. The instructions will come, Enoch said. The full instructions. What to build and how to build it, and what to put inside it. Everything you will need. And everyone else? Noah asked. The silence that followed was its own answer. Noah closed his eyes. He was not a man without grief. He was not a man who had so thoroughly prepared himself for this moment that it landed without weight. He had neighbors. He had people he had known his entire life. People who had made choices he disagreed with, whose lives had moved in directions he believed were wrong, but who were still, in the irreducible human sense, people, faces he recognized, names he knew, children he had watched grow up. They would not be on the ark. Not because God had not warned them. The Ethiopian tradition, and the broader rabbinic tradition that flows alongside it, is insistent that Noah warned his neighbors for years, decades, that he built in full public view precisely so that the building itself would be a warning, a visible, daily, impossible to ignore sign that something was coming, that the invitation was open long before the door was shut. But they did not come. They looked at the ark and they made their calculations. The sky was clear, the ground was dry. The man building the enormous boat in the middle of the land had always been a little strange. And they chose the world they knew, over the salvation they could not yet see. And the flood came anyway. Now let us stay for a moment with the question that the Ethiopian tradition asks of this story, the question that the Giz commentaries return to again and again, the question that the monks of Dibre, Damo, and the priests of Axum have been turning over in their theological hands for 16 centuries. What was the flood for? Not in the punitive sense. That question has an obvious answer. And the obvious answer is in every version of the story. The flood was for the removal of what the world had become, the cleansing of what could not be healed by lesser means. The reset, and this word is inadequate, but no word is adequate. The reset of the created order to a point from which it could begin again. But the Ethiopian tradition asks the deeper question. It asks, what was preserved? Because the flood is not only an ending, it is also a selection, a curation, a choosing of what the world after the flood would be built from. And what was chosen, who was chosen, tells you something essential about the theology of the whole account. Noah was of the line of Seth, who had been given Luluwa, the woman appointed for the righteous line, the bride of the slain, the root of the lineage that had tried, generation after generation, to maintain the distinction between the holy and the cursed, the mountain and the valley, the line of Adam's faithful descendants, and the line of the marked wanderer. That line survived, not perfectly, not without compromise, not without the generations of mixing and forgetting and descending from the mountain that had brought the world to the edge of the catastrophe in the first place. But the line survived, the thread of it, thin, frayed, barely visible in the tangle of human history by the time Noah was born. The thread survived, and the flood preserved it. This is the mercy inside the judgment. This is the thing that the Ethiopian tradition insists upon holding alongside the horror of the waters rising and the world being unmade. That inside the machinery of the judgment was a preserving hand. A hand that had been tracing that thread through the genealogies, through the generations, through all the choices and the failures and the partial successes of the line of Seth, all the way to a man with a face like his ancestors and a bone-deep willingness to build what he was told to build, even when the sky showed no sign of rain. The flood was judgment, and the flood was also the most dramatic act of preservation in the history of the world. Both things at the same time. This is the theological complexity that the short version of the story, the abbreviated Genesis account, does not have space to fully explore, but that the Ethiopian canon, with its additional texts and its centuries of commentary and its insistence that the full story must be told, holds open. The flood was not only wrath. The flood was also love. The terrible, specific, costly love of a creator who was willing to unmake what had been corrupted in order to save what could still be saved. Consider the women in this ending, because they are still here, even now, even at the edge of the flood. Awan is long gone. Her life carried out in the shadow of Cain's city, her son's name on the walls of a place that the flood would erase entirely. Her faithfulness in the impossible position never rewarded with the vindication she might have hoped for, but preserved quietly in the pages of Jubilees, in the knowledge that her name was worth writing down. Luluwa is long gone too, but her blood is in Noah, in the bones and the breath, and the bone-deep stubbornness of the man standing on the dry ground, watching the sky, the way you watch a sky that you have been told will soon open. She is in him the way that roots are in a tree, invisible, essential, holding. The daughters of men whose beauty caught the eyes of the watchers. They are gone. Their children are gone, or being unmade by Gabriel's assignment. Their world is collapsing around them in the specific way that worlds collapse when the foundations were wrong from the beginning. And Naamah. The tradition is divided on Naamah. Some strands say she perished in the flood with the rest of Cain's line. Some say she survived, that she found her way to Noah, that she was one of the women on the ark, that the voice that had moved the watchers was preserved through the flood in the body of the woman, who had never intended to move anyone at all. The Ethiopian tradition does not settle this question definitively. It leaves it open the way that honest traditions leave difficult questions open, not as a failure of knowledge, but as an acknowledgement that some things are held in a silence that is more truthful than any answer. What is settled is this: the flood came, the waters rose, the ark lifted, and on the surface of the water that covered everything, the cities and the valleys and the mountain and the fields and the bones of the Nephilim and the ruins of Cain's first city that had been named for his son, and was now being unnamed by the water. On the surface of all of that, a single vessel moved, carrying the thread, carrying the line, carrying the 8 souls: Noah, his wife, his sons, their wives, who were the entire future of the human story, wrapped in wood and pitch, and the breath-held silence of animals lying still in the dark below decks, carrying forward through the unmade world everything that the world after the flood would be built from. The water was cold. The sky above the water was blank and enormous, and inside the ark it was warm and dark and quiet. The way that the space between the ending of one thing and the beginning of another is always quiet, heavy with what has been, not yet lit by what is coming, suspended in the particular stillness of the moment between the last word of one chapter and the first word of the next. Breathe into that stillness now. Let it hold you. You are in the warm dark of the ark tonight. The water outside is doing what it was sent to do, and you are held. The thread of the faithful line runs through history all the way to this moment. To you, breathing slowly, the weight of the day releasing, the story settling around you like water finding its level. You did not arrive here by accident. No one does. The same hand that traced the thread through Luluwa and Seth, and the long faithful line to Noah, traces it still through every generation, to here, to now, to you. There are stories that look like one thing for a very long time, and then something shifts, a new angle of light, a different translation, a tradition that was preserved in a mountain monastery while the rest of the world was busy revising its understanding of what counted as important. And the story reveals itself to be something else entirely. Not contradicting what you thought you knew, not erasing it, but deepening it. Adding the dimension that was always there, but that the abbreviated version, the convenient version, the version that fit neatly into the categories the powerful preferred, that version had quietly removed. This is that shift. We have walked with the 4 women now. We have sat with Awan in the shadow of Cain's city. We have stood with Luluwa at the window of Seth's house, watching the smoke on the eastern horizon. We have moved through the crowd of unnamed daughters of men, feeling the weight of beauty that was never meant to be weaponized, but became a catalyst anyway. We have heard Naamah singing in her courtyard, innocent and unaware, her voice traveling upward through layers of air that human voices were not supposed to reach. We have seen what happened next. And now, in the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in the Ge'ez manuscripts, in the commentaries that the monks and priests and scholars of Exile and Lalibela and Debre Damo have been writing for 16 centuries, now comes the reframing. The question the Ethiopian tradition asks is not, what did these women do? The question it asks is, what were these women for? And the answer is different from anything the abbreviated Western reading of this story has tended to produce, because the abbreviated reading, the reading that got passed down through the centuries of canon formation and theological gatekeeping that reduced the full Ethiopian Bible to a much shorter document, that reading tends to position the women as the problem, as the point of vulnerability, as the crack in the wall through which the catastrophe entered. The daughters of men were beautiful, and the angels fell because of them. Naamah sang, and the watchers descended because of her. The women were the instrument of the falling. But the Ethiopian tradition says, wait, look again. Look at what the text actually records. The women did not swear the oath on Hermon. The women did not descend from the mountain. The women did not choose to receive the watchers. The women did not ask for the knowledge of swords and enchantments and astronomical manipulation. The women were not present at the council where Semyaza said, "Come, let us choose wives," and the 200 said yes. The women were there when the consequences arrived, but they were not the architects of the cause. The oath was sworn by angels. The descent was chosen by angels. The taking was done by angels. And the women, Awan with her impossible position, Luluwa with her appointed grief, the daughters of men with their ordinary human beauty, Naamah with her voice that was a gift and not a weapon. The women received what descended. They did not summon it. It found them. Now, here is where the Ethiopian theological reading does something that the Western tradition has rarely been willing to do with this story. It asks, if the women were not the cause, what were they? And the answer, the Ge'ez commentaries give, the answer that the priests of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church have been giving to this question in their homilies and their feast day reflections and their scriptural commentaries for a very long time is this: they were witnesses. They were the record. They were the ones whose experience of the catastrophe preserved, in the most immediate and bodily way possible, the full weight of what the Watchers had done. Because the Watchers' crime was not primarily a theological crime, not primarily a celestial disorder, not primarily a violation of the cosmic boundary between heaven and earth, though it was all of those things. It was primarily a human crime. It landed on human bodies. It was carried in human flesh. It was given birth to by human women who had not asked for any of it. And the cry that reached heaven, the cry that the 4 archangels heard, the cry that set the divine machinery in motion, that cry came through the women, through the daughters of men who could not feed their children, through the mothers of the Nephilim who sat in the pre-dawn dark with shaking hands, through the accumulated grief of a generation of women who had been standing at the point of impact between the heavenly rebellion and the human world. The cry was theirs, and God heard it. This is the reframing. The women were not the problem that needed to be solved. The women were the voice that called for the solution. They were the ones through whom the full cost of the Watcher's choice became audible to heaven. They were the measurement of the damage, and the measurement of the damage was the evidence that required the response. Without the cry, the response might not have come when it did. And without the women, there was no cry. Think about Awan again from this angle. A woman given to the murderer, to the marked one, to the man whose ground was cursed. She did not choose this, but she stayed. She bore a son. She raised him in a city built on defiance, in a lineage moving steadily away from God, in a world that was getting harder and stranger every generation. And she stayed faithful to what she could be faithful to, not to Cain's rebellion. The text does not record Awan as a participant in any of the escalating violence of Cain's line. She is simply there, present, faithful in the limited, costly, unglamorous way of people who cannot change the large things around them, and so pour themselves into the small things within their reach. She was a witness. She saw everything. And the fact that Jubilees thought her name worth recording, the fact that a scribe somewhere in the long chain of copying looked at the genealogy and said, "Her name belongs here, it must not be left out," that is not an accident. That is a theological statement. The tradition is saying, she was here, she mattered. Her presence inside the impossible situation was not incidental. It was essential. Now think about Luluwa, appointed for the righteous line, given to Seth, bearing children whose names became the stepping stones of the faithful genealogy. She did not perform heroics. She did not receive visions. She did not compose psalms or lead armies or build arks. She raised children. She remembered. She stood at the window and watched the smoke of Cain's city and did not let herself forget what was over there, what the world contained, what the boundary between the mountain and the valley was protecting against. She kept the memory alive in her household. The memory of what had happened, why the separation mattered, what was at stake in the long, slow work of maintaining the distinction. She was the memory of the righteous line. And without memory, there is no faithfulness. There is only the present moment, which is too small to hold the full weight of what faithfulness requires. Luluwa held the memory, and the memory held the line, and the line held Noah, and Noah held the future. Trace that chain back to its beginning, and it begins with a woman standing at a window, watching smoke on the horizon, choosing not to look away. And the daughters of men, those unnamed, collective, ordinary women whose beauty became the point of impact for the watcher's descent. The Ethiopian tradition asks us to see them not as passive instruments of someone else's falling, but as the specific human reality that heaven could not ignore. Their experience was the indictment. Their suffering was the evidence. Their cry was the petition that heaven received and acted on. They were not beautiful in order to cause the fall. They were beautiful because they were human. Because beauty is one of the things that humanity was made with. Because the world was made full of beautiful things, full of light and stone and water, and the particular quality of a human face in the moment before sleep, relaxed and open and impossibly vulnerable. And the watcher's crime was not that they noticed beauty. It was that they decided their noticing entitled them to take. The beauty was not the sin. The taking was the sin. And finally, Naamah, the singer, the woman whose voice opened something in the watchers that desire had no name for and no framework to manage. Here is what the Ethiopian tradition says about Naamah in the stillness of its long reflection on this story. Her voice was a gift from God, not from Cain's line, not from the cursed bloodline, not from the accumulated violence and defiance of 7 generations of men who built cities on cursed ground and forged weapons and composed songs about their own murders. Her voice was a gift that had passed through all of that, through the curse and the exile and the genealogy of the fallen, and had arrived in her as something that was still, despite everything, genuinely beautiful, genuinely good. A gift that God had placed in an unlikely vessel, and that had survived the journey through the corrupted bloodline intact. She did not know what it would set in motion. She sang because she was made to sing. And the tradition says, this is not her guilt, this is her testimony. Because the fact that something genuinely beautiful could exist inside the line of Cain, the line of the murderer, the marked man, the wanderer, the city builder on cursed ground, that fact is itself a kind of grace, a demonstration that the creative generosity of God does not confine itself to the deserving, that gifts arrive in all kinds of vessels. That beauty does not wait for a pure bloodline before it agrees to be born. Naamah's voice was not a weapon. It was a grace that was misused by beings who should have known better. The guilt was theirs, the gift was hers, and the gift survived, even if Naamah herself did not survive the flood. Even if her voice fell silent in the waters that unmade the world she had been born into. The gift that her voice represented, the testimony that beauty can exist inside the most broken of lineages, the witness that grace does not confine itself to clean genealogies. That survived. It always survives. Breathe slowly now. Let the reframing settle into you like warmth settling into cold hands held near a fire. The women were not the villains of this story. They were the witnesses, the memory, the cry, and the grace. They were the ones through whom the full cost of the catastrophe became visible to heaven. They were the ones whose names, Awan, Luluwa, the daughters of men, Naamah, were considered worth writing down, worth preserving, worth carrying through 3,000 years of copying and translating and hiding in clay jars, in desert caves, and locking behind iron doors in mountain monasteries. Worth telling tonight, in the quiet, to you, there is a particular kind of mercy that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with trumpets or with the dramatic reversal that stories tend to promise. The moment when everything that was wrong is suddenly, spectacularly, undeniably made right. It does not come in the form of vindication, where the faithful person is publicly recognized and the unfaithful person is publicly shamed, and the record is corrected in front of everyone who witnessed the original injustice. It comes quietly. It comes in the form of continuation, in the fact that the line did not end, that the thread held, that there was a Noah when a Noah was needed, that there was an ark when an ark was needed, that the 8 souls who entered the vessel, carrying in their bodies the entire genetic and spiritual inheritance of everything the human story had produced that was worth carrying forward, that those 8 souls emerged on the other side of the water into a world that was wet and raw and beginning again. That is the mercy. Not dramatic, not spectacular, not the kind of ending that makes a good story in the conventional sense, just continuation, just the thread still intact. just life persisting on the other side of the worst thing that had happened to the world since the expulsion from Eden. The line that survived was Seth's line, and Seth's line was Luluwa's line, and Luluwa's line ran back through the genealogies, through Enos and Cain and Mahalalel and Jared, through the long succession of names that the abbreviated reading of Genesis rattles through in a single chapter without pausing to feel the weight of each one. Back through all of those faithful, flawed, ordinary, extraordinary people who had made the choice, generation after generation, to stay on the mountain, to remember, to maintain the separation, to resist the pull of the valley and the smoke of Cain's city on the horizon, and the songs drifting up from below that made the world down there seem more alive, more immediate, more full of pleasure than the quiet faithfulness of the high ground. They did not always succeed. The line is not a record of perfect obedience. It is a record of imperfect faithfulness, which is a different thing, and in many ways a more honest and more instructive thing. Because perfect obedience is a category that exists in theology, but rarely in the lives of actual human beings, trying to maintain their integrity across multiple generations in a world that is constantly offering them more compelling alternatives. Imperfect faithfulness is what most of us are actually capable of, and imperfect faithfulness, it turns out, is enough. The line held, not perfectly, not without the mixing and the forgetting and the descending from the mountain that had contributed to the catastrophe in the first place. But enough. The thread was thin enough by the time of Noah that if you had looked at the genealogy from the outside, you might have wondered whether it was still really a thread at all, or simply a wishful description of a few genetic connections between people who had largely abandoned whatever the thread was supposed to represent. But God was not looking from the outside. God was looking at Noah, and in Noah's face, in the set of his jaw, and the steadiness of his eyes, and the particular quality of his attention, when he turned it toward the sky, or toward the ground, or toward the faces of his children, God saw the thread, clear and intact, running back through every generation of imperfect faithfulness to the beginning, to Seth, to Luluwa, to the window and the watching and the choosing not to look away. Now, let us stay for a moment with what the flood left behind, not what it destroyed. We have been with that. We have felt the weight of it. We have sat inside the silence of the waters rising and the world being unmade. But what it left behind, what the receding waters revealed when they finally, slowly withdrew, is a different kind of testimony. They revealed ground, clean ground, ground that had been washed of everything the Watchers had introduced. The weapons were gone. The enchantments were gone. The metallurgical secrets and the astronomical manipulation and the arts of war and beautification that had been given too early and used too recklessly, gone. The Nephilim were gone. The oath on Hermon was bound and sealed and imprisoned in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations. The ground was clean, and on the clean ground the ark rested, and from the ark 8 people stepped out into the morning air of the world after the flood. And the first thing Noah did was build an altar. Not a city, not a weapon, not a wall. An altar, a place of offering, a place of turning toward rather than turning away, a place of acknowledging that the survival was not his own achievement, that the thread had been held by hands that were not his, that the continuation of the human story was not something he had engineered, but something he had been faithful enough to receive. He built an altar and he offered what he had, and the text records that God smelled the offering and was moved by it. That phrase, so ancient, so anthropomorphic, so stubbornly resistant to the theological refinements that later centuries would try to impose on it. That phrase is one of the most intimate moments in the entire Hebrew Bible. God smelled the offering. The creator of the universe, the one who had sent the flood, the one who had bound the watchers and assigned the archangels and chosen Noah from all the people of his generation. That one leaned toward the smoke of an altar, built on clean ground by a man who had just survived the end of the world and was moved. This is the God of the Ethiopian Bible, not a God of pure abstraction, not a God of cold judicial procedure, a God who can be moved, who smells the smoke and responds, who sees the altar built by trembling hands on ground that is still wet from the flood and says, yes, this is what I was preserving. This is what the thread was for. This moment, this man, this offering. The covenant that follows is one that the Ethiopian tradition reads not merely as a legal agreement. I will not flood the earth again. Here is a rainbow as the seal, but as a theological declaration about the nature of the relationship between the Creator and the creation going forward. I will never again curse the ground because of man, God says in the text of Genesis, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Read that carefully. He is not saying, I will not flood the earth again because humanity has been fixed, because the problem has been solved, because the flood accomplished a permanent correction of the human condition and things will be different from now on. He is saying, I know what humanity is. I know that the heart inclines toward what it inclines toward. I know that the tendency to descend from the mountain, to mix the lines, to choose the valley over the high ground, I know that this tendency does not disappear with the flood water. It is written into the structure of human experience. It is part of what it means to be human. And I am choosing, knowing all of that, to remain in relationship with this thing I made. Not because it has become worthy of relationship, because relationship is what I choose. This is the mercy that does not announce itself. This is the continuation that is more profound than any dramatic vindication. God looked at the ground after the flood, at the clean, wet earth, at the altar, at the man standing beside it, with hands that were still trembling slightly from the weight of everything that had happened. And God said, I am still here. I am not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, and I know what comes next, I know the full arc of it. I know every generation between this man and the last generation. I am still here. That is the covenant, not a legal guarantee, a presence, a committed, unshakable, fully informed presence. And the line continued, from Noah through Shem, through the long genealogy of the post-flood world, through Arphaxad and Shelah and Eber and Peleg and Reu and Serug and Nahor and Terah, all the way to a man who would be called out of Ur of the Chaldeans to follow a voice he had never heard before toward a land he had never seen, asked to trust a promise he could not yet verify. Abraham, Woe's line would eventually produce the prophets, the Psalms, the kings, the exiles, the returnees, the scribe in the temple, the voice crying in the wilderness, and, in the fullness of what the Ethiopian canon calls the hidden years and the appointed time, the one in whom all the lines converge, the thread ran all the way there. Through Awan's faithfulness in the impossible position, through Luluwa's memory at the window, through the unnamed daughters of men whose cry reached heaven, through Naamah's voice that was a grace even when it was misused, through the flood and the altar and the covenant and the rainbow, through every imperfect generation of people who managed, despite everything, to pass the thread from one pair of hands to the next without letting it drop entirely. The thread held. It always held. Not because of the strength of the ones who held it, because of the one who chose it. And tonight, breathing slowly in the quiet, you are part of that continuation. Not perfectly, not without stumbling. Not with the clean hands of someone who has never descended from the mountain, or been distracted by the smoke on the horizon, or forgotten, in the press of ordinary life, what the thread was for, but faithfully, one day at a time, one breath at a time, the line survived, and so have you. Rest in that now, deep and complete and unhurried. The story is almost finished, but there is one more scene, one more farewell. One that has been waiting quietly at the edge of everything we have walked through tonight. Patient, still, full of a love that the 4 women and the watchers and the flood and the covenant and all the centuries of imperfect faithfulness were always moving toward. Enoch is waiting. His son is coming. And the last thing the scribe of heaven will say to the boy who loved him is almost too beautiful to speak aloud. The evening Enoch said goodbye. The sky was the color of embers, not the violent orange of a fire at its height, but the deeper, quieter color that comes after. When the flames have done their work, and what remains is a glow that has no urgency in it, only warmth, only the last long exhalation of something that burned completely and left nothing unconsumed. The hills beyond the settlement caught that light and held it. The air was still, the kind of still that feels intentional, as if the world itself has paused to pay attention to what is about to happen. Methuselah had known for some time, not the exact moment. Fathers do not always announce the exact moment to their children, even when the children are grown, even when the children have children of their own, even when the children are old enough that the word children has become a courtesy rather than a description. Methuselah was not a young man. He had lived long enough to understand that there are things you know before you are told them, things that arrive in the body before they arrive in the mind, a heaviness, a quality of attention in the one you love that is different from ordinary attention, more complete, more still, more like the attention of someone who is memorizing rather than simply seeing. He had felt that quality in his father for weeks. And so when Enoch called him to sit outside in the evening light, Methuselah came without asking why. He sat beside his father on the low stone bench outside the door of the house. The stone was warm from the day's sun. The settlement was quiet around them. The ordinary sounds of evening, children called in from their playing, the smell of food, the distant low sound of animals settling. The world going about its business, indifferent to the fact that something was ending in this particular corner of it. Enoch looked at his son for a long time without speaking. Methuselah let him look. This was one of the things he had learned from his father: the capacity to be looked at without flinching, without filling the silence with nervous speech, without demanding that the attention resolve itself into words before it was ready to be words. His father had taught him that silence was not absence, that the spaces between sentences were not empty but full, full of what had not yet found its form, full of what was true before it was expressible. So Methuselah sat and let his father look. "You have your mother's eyes," Enoch said finally. Methuselah smiled. "You have told me that my whole life, because it has been true your whole life." Enoch's voice was quiet. Not the quiet of weakness, but the quiet of someone who has learned that volume and importance are not the same thing, that the most essential things are said softly, and because every time I see it, I am grateful. Your mother was wiser than I was. She saw things I missed. She held things I could not hold. She said the same of you. She was being kind. She was being accurate, Methuselah said, and there was a brief, warm silence between them, the silence of two people who have loved the same person, and who carry that shared love as a bond between them that does not require explanation. Then Enoch turned and looked at the sky. The ember light was fading slowly. The first stars were beginning to appear, faint at first, uncertain, the way stars look in the earliest moments of evening before the sky fully commits to darkness and they can be fully themselves. "I have written everything down," Enoch said. "Everything I saw, everything I was shown. The heavens and the movements of the lights and the names of the angels and the verdict and the binding and the flood that is coming. All of it is in the scrolls. You know where they are. I know where they are," Methuselah said. "Guard them, not just the physical scrolls. Guard what they contain. The understanding that the world is not ungoverned, that what happens on the earth is seen from above, that the cry of the suffering reaches heaven and heaven responds. Guard that understanding. Pass it to your son. Tell him to pass it to his. Do not let it become a formality. Do not let it become the kind of truth that people repeat without feeling. Make sure they feel it." Methuselah was quiet for a moment. "I am afraid," he said, "that I will not do it as well as you did." Enoch turned from the sky and looked at his son. "You will not do it as I did," he said. "You will do it as you do it, which is the only way it can be done. I was given what I was given, the visions, the journeys, the words. You are given what you are given. It will look different. It will feel different. Do not spend your life trying to reproduce what I was given. Receive what is yours. What if what is mine is less? Enoch shook his head, slowly, with the certainty of a man who has been close enough to the source of things to know the answer to this question from the inside. Nothing given by God is less, he said. It is different. Different is not less. The scribe is not less than the prophet. The father is not less than the visionary. The man who guards the scrolls is not less than the man who wrote them. You do not need me, Methuselah. You have the scrolls. You have the words. You have the Lord. Methuselah's throat tightened. He had promised himself he would not do this, would not make his father's leaving harder by making it about his own grief. But the body does not always comply with the mind's promises. The throat does what the throat does. The eyes fill without asking permission. I have always had those things, he said, his voice careful and controlled. I have never needed them the way I will need them when you are gone. Enoch reached out and put his hand on his son's face, an old hand, marked by decades of writing, the particular calluses of a man who has spent his life pressing a reed pen against vellum, making permanent what was given to him in vision and dream, and the long, quiet hours of walking with God in the early morning, when the world was still, and the presence was close, and the distance between the human and the divine was thinner than at any other time of day. An old hand, warm and specific and completely present. Listen to me, Enoch said. I am not leaving you unguarded. I am not walking into absence. Where I am going is not away from you. It is simply further along the same road we have both been walking. And the one who walks beside me on that road walks beside you too, has always walked beside you, will walk beside you every morning of your life, and every evening, and every night when the world is dark and the scrolls feel like cold paper rather than living words. Methuselah closed his eyes, felt his father's hand on his face, memorized the weight of it. I know, he said. I know all of that. And still, Enoch agreed. Yes, and still. They sat together as the last of the ember light faded from the hills. The stars came fully out now, not faint and uncertain, but clear and absolute. The great wheel of them turning overhead with the steady indifference of things that have been doing what they do for longer than the human world has existed to observe them. Enoch looked up at them. I have been shown where each of those lights goes, he said quietly. I have seen the chambers where they rest. I have seen the angels assigned to them. I have seen the order of it, the vast, intricate, perfect order of the thing that looks from down here like simply darkness scattered with fire. He paused. It is not darkness scattered with fire, he said. It is fire, all of it, from edge to edge. The darkness is the smaller thing. Methuselah looked up too, side by side, father and son, in the cooling evening air, looking up at the stars, the way that human beings have always looked up at stars, with the combination of smallness and wonder that is one of the most distinctly human experiences the world contains. The feeling of being very small beneath something very large, and finding that the smallness is not frightening but clarifying, that the largeness does not diminish you but locates you, places you, reminds you that you are part of something whose scale you cannot fully grasp, and whose order you can trust, precisely because you did not make it. Then Enoch stood slowly, with the particular care of an old body that has been used hard and faithfully, and is not complaining, simply noting its own age with a kind of quiet dignity. Methuselah stood too. They looked at each other in the starlight. "Will I see you again?" Methuselah asked. He had not planned to ask it. It came out of the place where children live, inside grown men. The place that does not age, that does not develop the protective sophistication of adulthood, that simply wants what it wants with an honesty that bypasses everything else. Enoch smiled. It was the smile of a man who knows something the person he is smiling at does not yet know. Not a superior smile, not a withholding smile, but the smile of someone who has seen the road ahead and found it to be better than the road behind. "Everything that is real continues," he said. "I have seen it. It continues." He put his hands on his son's shoulders. "Guard the scrolls, raise your son, walk faithfully. That is enough. It has always been enough." And then he turned, and he walked into the dark between the houses toward the edge of the settlement, toward the open ground beyond the last wall. And Methuselah watched him go, watched the familiar shape of his father's back, the particular way he carried his shoulders, the walk he had known his entire life, watched it move away from him through the starlight. And then something changed in the air, not dramatically, not with fire or thunder, or the spectacular visual language of divine intervention that the imagination reaches for. Just a change, a quality shift, the way the air changes when something has been present that is now gone, the way a room feels different after someone leaves it. That particular quality of absence that is also, somehow, a different kind of presence. The presence of what was, which is its own form of continuing. Enoch was gone. Methuselah stood for a long time, looking at the place where his father had been. Then he knelt, not from grief, not from the particular kind of sorrow that comes with ordinary loss, the grief of endings, of things that are over, of doors that have closed and will not open again. He knelt from wonder, from the overwhelming, clarifying, humbling weight of having been loved by someone who walked with God, of having been held by hands that had touched the hem of the heavenly, of having heard in an ordinary voice on an ordinary evening beside a warm stone wall, words that would outlive every wall and every stone and every generation between that evening and the last evening of the world. The stars turned overhead. The world was quiet. And Methuselah remained, kneeling in the dark, not from grief, but from wonder, with the scrolls inside, waiting to be guarded, with the thread intact, with everything he needed. Tonight you heard the names they almost erased. Awan, Luluwa, the daughters of men, Naamah, 4 women who stood at the hinge of the oldest story in the world, not as villains, not as victims, but as witnesses, as the ones through whom the full cost of the falling was made visible, as the ones whose cry, rising through the layers of ancient air, reached the ears of heaven and set the divine response in motion. You heard it all tonight, the oath on the cold summit of Hermon, the descent, the births, the consuming, the crying of the earth. The 4 archangels turning toward the wound, Enoch standing in the silence of fallen angels, having delivered the word he was given, without distortion, without flinching, without adding to it or taking from it. And then the flood, and then the altar, and then the covenant, not a legal guarantee, but a presence. A committed, fully informed, unshakable presence that chose relationship with the broken thing it made and has not stopped choosing it since. The thread held, it holds still. You are part of that continuation tonight, not perfectly, not without stumbling, but faithfully, one step at a time. The same hand that traced the thread through Awan's impossible faithfulness, through Luluwa's memory, through the unnamed daughters whose cry reached heaven, through Naamah's grace that survived the cursed bloodline, that hand traces it still, through every generation, through every night like this one, when the weight of the world releases slowly and the body finally agrees to rest. So close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the names settle like dust after a long journey. Let the story find its resting place inside you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you, and may you rest tonight in His perfect peace. This is Pastor Michael. Sleep well, and may the angels of heaven guard your rest. Amen.